So for folks who don't know anything about two-spirited folks or individuals, one thing that's really important to note is that two-spirit people were generally seen as quite highly regarded in their communities. Not only were two-spirit people oftentimes seen as being able to communicate with the divine, and they were oftentimes put in position of like community healers. They would also often achieve more practical community roles as well. For example, two-spirit people would oftentimes adopt orphan children in communities if their parents have passed away. Two-spirit. As an umbrella term, two-spirit may encompass same-sex attraction and a wide variety of gender variants, including people who might be described in Western culture as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, transgender, genderqueer, or those who have multiple gender identities. Two-spirit is a pan-Indigenous term that was created in 1990 at the Indigenous Lesbian and Gay International Gathering in Winnipeg to replace Berdosh. We're going to get to her later. There are cultural and specific terms to describe people who are two-spirited in other Indigenous groups on Turtle Island, North America, and world cultures. So as you saw here, two-spirit came about in 1990. It's actually not as old and deep-rooted as you might think it is. Mi'kmaq, for example, didn't have anything like two-spirited, for example, but we did have phrases and words that would describe people who might be gay. For example, there's a sort of a phrase in my culture that is, he likes men, she likes men, they like women, so on and so forth. It's less of a labeling and more of an action. So moving on to Berdosh, which is a word maybe some of you don't know. It's quite interesting. Berdosh is an early European designation for Indigenous people in Canada who did not conform to Western gender and sexual norms. The term held negative implications for a variety of sexual behavior, gender practices, and various physical sex characteristics, such as intersexed humans. Berdosh is translated to passive partner in sodomy or boy prostitute. It is important to note too, this term is very outdated. We would say something like sex worker today, but this is sort of how two-spirit people would be referred to as. Sodomy or buggery, British English, is generally anal or oral sex between people or sexual activity between a person and a non-human animal, bestiality. But it may also mean any non-procreative sexual activity. You have this word which is sort of implying that people who may appear to be trans, gender variant, non-binary, folks who don't fit into with the popular gender norms or standards, not even standards, but just like the dominant norm, are seen as being beastly or a sex worker or a non-consenting sex worker, I should mind you, because sex work is real work, of course. But in these times, this would have been more of a power imbalance than anything, especially where I believe Berdosh has Roman Catholic roots. So I'm not entirely sure how the history plays into it, but I'm pretty sure this would be around the time when oftentimes like people in high power would frequent the chambers of young boys who had no authority standing whatsoever. And so there's this sort of deep-rooted kind of submissiveness to this word that is being placed on a group of people simply for existing. It's very interesting, especially the aspect of bestiality. I can't go back in time and figure out how this word exactly was used and how long it was used. But it was around long enough that Indigenous people were like, this is an issue and we need to change it. And this is when in 1990, once again. So it's not too long ago that this word was like still technically in use, regardless if people like had it in their back pocket or not. So you have a lot in there, these ideas around Indigenous people being beastly, being savages, being uncontrolled and animalistic, and then throwing Bardosh on top of that. So it's kind of a long history of people applying these ideas and names onto a group of folks, which then justifies their mistreatment. So consent and power. People do not need your consent to create a false but widely accepted depiction of your character. Once this perception of you or your people have been created, it's difficult to separate yourself from this narrative. Additionally, if this perception is unfavorable enough to the wider population or school or community, it makes it much easier for others to treat you without compassion or understanding. So, kind of bringing everything back into an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous people have not been able to create the popular narrative around colonization and about themselves. Indigenous people did not consent to being labeled as savages, and Two Spirit individuals did not consent to being labeled as Bardosh. However, this false narrative was justification enough for further violence to ensue. You have these scenarios of sort of the people with authority, the people with power, the people who control the government, who are the government, are able to perpetuate stereotypes in order to maintain the power imbalance in their favor. And then you have my people who are subjugated to reservations, who are put into residential schools, who are killed and murdered, and so on and so forth, because of these ideas and these perceptions about ourselves and about our vibe, about who we are. So moving on to this section, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. Um, so this is where things are gonna start getting a bit harder, mind you. So take care of yourselves, get some water, play with a cat, play with a fidget toy, whatever works best for you. So for those of you who do not know about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, it is a movement that exists because of sort of the unprecedented and undocumented murders of Indigenous women that have taken place all across Turtle Island, um, and in Canada and in the States. So there is a nationwide crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Indigenous women are more likely to go missing or be murdered than any other ethnicity because the population of Indigenous people is small, making up about 2% of the population. It is not reported on a lot. However, more than 4 out of 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence in their lives. This is from Madison Hunter, and she's sort of referencing this doctor named Dr. Dolfer, who did a study on sort of the ways and reasons why Indigenous women go missing so frequently. And I'm going to kind of read with you this sort of piece because it kind of summarizes everything I could hope to talk about in this section quite articulately. Okay, so starting right here, in many cases, negative stereotypes play a role in the lack of prosecution and investigation into these matters, referring to missing and murdered Indigenous women. The victims are often blamed for a variety of reasons like alcohol, drug use, or houselessness. In addition to hypersexualization and dehumanization of Indigenous women, plays a role in the disproportionate rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women. In American society in general, there is a hypersexualization of women, Dofer said. In addition, many Americans think of being American Indian Indigenous as not a real identity for people, but as something that is fun to pretend about. It has real consequences. I think the men who commit these horrible crimes are able to do so because they don't see their victims as real people. Because of negative stereotypes, when Indigenous women go missing, the search for them is oftentimes hindered. Many times, law enforcement doesn't take reports seriously, and the media rarely reports on these matters. So this is from the official website for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women sort of page. I have all of my sources like linked in my notes, by the way. Um, but there's this one quote, this one section that really kind of stuck with me. In Andrea Smith's paper, Not an Indian Tradition, The Sexual Colonization of Native Peoples, she explores the connection between sexual violence and colonialism in the lives of Native people in the United States. Smith reveals that that natives were viewed as dirty for their lack of clothing, which in the minds of colonists made them polluted with sexual sin. They were seen as less than human. And now, when a Native woman is reported missing, these negative stereotypes hinder the search process. Law enforcement tends to turn a blind eye, fail to take the report seriously, and do little to assist. The media rarely picks up on any of the stories, and if they do, there is normally a negative spin on the story, making the victim seem at fault. So once again, this like sort of idea and this reality of misogyny, patriarchy, and inaction keeps people in harm's way. And when you take misogyny and race and put them together, it creates another problem. It creates an issue that can't be solved with just misogyny. You have to look at the racism that is also involved in these cases.